Channel's Review. The search for missing teens in Israel ends in tragedy. Remembering the Freedom Summer 50 years later, sitting down with members of Knesset, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. The 3 Israeli teenagers considered missing for 18 days, and for whose return many Jews around the world had prayed, were found dead this week. 16-year-olds Gilad Shar and Naftali Frankel and 19-year-old Eyal Yifrah were abducted on June 12th while hitchhiking in the West Bank. Many reports cite Israeli government sources claiming the youths were killed almost immediately after their capture. Their bodies were hidden in an area near Hebron. Their funerals were held Tuesday afternoon in a joint service and burial. Israel has named its 2 prime suspects, describing them as Hamas activists. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reinforced the meaning of this identification, declaring in a statement, quote, "Hamas is responsible and Hamas will pay." Hamas officials have not claimed responsibility, though they have praised the kidnapping. After rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel on Monday, Israel dropped 34 bombs on a Hamas compound in the Gazan city of Rafah, claiming that the bombing was a response only to the rockets and not to the killing of the teenagers. The killing of the 3 boys came as a shock to many in the global Jewish community who had held out hope, expressed in prayer services on social media and elsewhere, that the boys had somehow continued to survive amid the ordeal. A memorial service in New York featured some leading lights in the community. Here is some of what transpired.
Profoundly here. Not totally unexpected. There were hints that sadly we were heading in this direction. But the confirmation, for me personally and for many people I know in this neighborhood, was like a punch in the stomach.
We come here tonight, and once again, in our own way, we say, Mizanado. We're here as we look at the pictures of these young people.
And now when we speak of Naftali, we must use the word was and not the word is. My cousin Naftali is somewhere else right now. He's with God.
Today was the burial. It gets worse as time goes along, because the emptiness of not having their sons in their homes, in their beds, at their Shabbat tables, I can't, it's too frightening for me to even contemplate.
We as Americans have had enough experience in believing that what happens to someone else's children could very easily happen to our own. So for those of the Jewish faith, please don't consider this an issue that just pains you. It scares and jolts the sense of humanity that all of us have.
But unfortunately, this horrible occurrence is a reminder of the threat Israelis face, and not just Israelis, but increasingly Jews in Paris or Brussels and other places face every day of their lives.
The Jewish people will be grieving for our 3 young sons for a long, long time. And we will never forget the children who were taken from us or who killed them.
After Israel announced the deaths of the 3 teenagers, President Barack Obama issued his first statement about the boys since their abduction, saying, "The United States condemns in the strongest possible terms this senseless act of terror against innocent youth," adding, "As a father, I cannot imagine the indescribable pain that the parents of these teenage boys are experiencing." In other news relating to Israel's retaliation efforts for Palestinians' crimes against Israelis, an important decision by the Israeli Supreme Court has determined the scope of such retaliation efforts. A Palestinian man indicted for the murder of a senior Israeli police officer in recent months may legally have his home demolished by the Israeli government as collective punishment for his alleged crimes. The court's decision is allowing the collective punishment because the court believes the killer shared his plans with his family and some of the family members collaborated with him. Moving on, here in the United States, remembering a struggle for civil rights 50 years after the Freedom Summer. Meredith Gansman reports on some of the Jewish efforts as part of that.
This week, the country celebrates a day of freedom, the United States' 238th Independence Day. It's also the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Freedom Summer. in which thousands of volunteers, many of whom were Jewish, tried to register African American voters in Mississippi. Their efforts were often met with violent opposition. During the campaign on June 21, 1964, 3 volunteers, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, were abducted and murdered. Their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam later that summer on August 4th. Recently, the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding memorialized these 3 youths who gave their lives for civil rights at the Capitol building. Several members of Congress attended.
So I'm very appreciative of this commemoration, this interfaith gathering, this interracial gathering. That's what Freedom Summer was all about.
It is time again for us to rally, because the efforts that you see and read about every day, voter ID, is the same thing that happened 50 years ago. It has a new kind of presentation, and they don't wear sheets.
The ceremony also commemorated the historical alliance between African Americans and Jews that brought social and political change to the country. Rabbi Mark Schneier and business mogul Russell Simmons founded the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding 25 years ago to reinforce Jewish American and African American relations.
There was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to Dr. King and to African American as did the Jewish community.
Congressman Bill Foster says Jewish Americans and African Americans have a shared history of persecution, oppression, and subjection.
It comes in part, I'm sure, from having been underdogs.
It's not that we have shared a common faith, but we have shared a common fate.
However, after Dr. King's assassination, the relationship between American Jews and African Americans became more tense, the lowest point being the Crown Heights riots of 1991. Since 1989, the FFEU has held racial harmony events and Martin Luther King Jr. memorial programs to rediscover the shared values of the 2 communities. Now, Rabbi Schneier says the relationship between the African American and Jewish American community is one of cooperation and not conflict. And so the foundation is focusing on Muslim-Jewish relations. Imam Shamsi Ali works with the FFEU to change the mindset and mistrust that these communities can have for each other.
Many Muslims still believe that any bad thing happens to the Muslim community is being orchestrated by the Jewish people.
One program developed to change these beliefs is the Weekend of Twinning. Muslims visit synagogues, Jews visit mosques.
Changing the perception is not about talking. It is about living the dialogue itself. It's about smiling one another. It's about, building friendship and partnership.
For the Jewish Channel, I'm Meredith Gansman.
Thank you, Meredith. Generating an opportunity for young Jewish professionals to engage their support for Israel was the Jewish National Fund's Shabbat in the Park. Christian Needon has that story.
Heavy rains threatened to wash out one of New York City's largest and most lively outdoor Shabbat meals. But as the young professional membership of JNF Future gathered for their annual Shabbat in the Park at Central Park Zoo, the skies cleared. And amidst all the revelry for the youth arm of the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, a nonprofit founded in 1901 to buy land in Israel and which has switched to an environmental focus, I talked to JNF Future co-founder Ellie Jacobs about his original hopes for the 8-year-old organization.
The purpose of JNF Future was really to bridge the gap between the kids who are going on alternative spring break or the Alexander Muss High School program and high school, and then the kids that go on Birthright. JNF really didn't have anything for them until they were 40 or 50 and making a lot of money and could donate significant sums of money. And we're really plugging that gap so that the JNF is really a continuum through people's from grade school straight through retirement.
But before proceeding with that new approach to JNF's future, it had to be given the go-ahead by the then leadership of JNF New York.
It took a little bit of time to sell them on the idea of doing a young leadership, but it's been 7.5, 8 years of just absolutely amazing growth. It amazes me to come to this every year, and I know fewer and fewer people each year because it's just a new crop. And that's really great. It's the growth that we want to see.
Jeffrey Levine shares that sentiment. The current national president of JNF Levine headed JNF's New York chapter when JNF Future was proposed and approved, and said he was all for the organization's event-driven approach to attracting young membership.
Not only Shabbos in the park, which as you can see here today, even in a driving thunder and lightning downpour, is attracting 400 to 500 young like-minded people. But we have the Shabbos in the park. We have an event which we call the Garden of Eden, where we have almost 1,000 young people, all of whom are expressing an interest not only in Judaism, in Israel, and in each other, which is good.
Jacobs said that a generational shift has already begun to take place, with JNF Future leaders moving up to leadership roles in the larger JNF New York chapter.
At least 3 of the kind of core original members are now board members in New York, which is really, that's what we want. That's the ideal that we want.
To see more from JNF Future's annual Shabbat in the Park at Central Park Zoo, please tune into the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Christian. Finally, discussing Israel with 2 members of Knesset alongside the books they've written is the theme of this week's episode of Up Close. Ruth Calderon made her name internationally known when she delivered a Talmud lecture at her inauguration into the Knesset. A PhD in Talmud, Calderon is bringing the lessons of that scholarship to bear on her work in the Knesset, and she's also gaining a further reputation for her work on the Talmud as well. We discuss the Talmud, Israel, and more amid the new English translation of one of her books, A Bride for One Night. And another headline-making member of Knesset is a fellow member of Calderon's in the Yesh Atid party, but coming from near the opposite end of the religious spectrum. The American-born Rabbi Dov Lipman describes himself as ultra-Orthodox, or Haredi in Hebrew, and yet for years now he's described one of his major tasks as bringing the most extreme ultra-Orthodox away from the edge. We discuss his book, To Unify a Nation, My Vision for the Future of Israel. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Ruth Calderon. So for someone who knows relatively little about the Talmud, what do you think is the most surprising story that you've put in there?
The most surprising story is the name of the book, A Bride for One Night. The fact that rabbis used to, and they are not ashamed to write it in the Talmud, they used to go when they traveled, when they were in a faraway city or town, they would ask who would marry them for a night. They would marry a woman, they would be with her for the night or 2 days, and then they would divorce or not and go home. And that is quite a radical concept that I think is worth some thinking.
Right. And you offer what you suggest could be a feminist reading on a lot of these, but you also suggest in the introduction that feminist readings aren't always recoverable. That that there's not necessarily a way to read into the text what you want, but you settle with that.
The text is not feminist, and the text is not democratic. It's not, like my father wasn't, and I still love him. The Talmud is a male-dominant, not feminist and not democratic text, and a part of me is also, I can be a feminist, but I don't want to fall into being bitter and angry all the time. It's boring. So I can read it once from the feminist side, and sometimes I do feel like giving them, my thoughts. And sometimes I read it from the scholar point of view, which is much more sensitivity, a sensibility of how to live, rather than you're completely wrong. And that's less interesting.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.